Um, well, just let me briefly introduce as an overview this draft paper which I let circulate, that comes out from a research that has been published as the book Science and the Decolonization of Social Theory Eric was talking about, which basically started from three, let's call it post-Eurocentric, anti-Eurocentric assumptions, which Rewin Connell has touched in her presentation. That is the critique to the pristine European character of modern science, then the idea that modern science represents a rupture in time and a difference in space compared to other scientific traditions, and the idea that the colonial encounter through science can be read in terms of penetration of colonial and imperial sciences, while actually it has always been a negotiation, a continuous negotiation. But after the attempt to decolonize social theory through specific concepts such as the global emancipation, accumulation of capital, I realized that there was something more going on that prevented social theory actually to be decolonized. And it is what we could define in terms of the protocols of concept formation that avoids different alternative paths to concept being actually pursued in social theory. What I refer to is the hidden logic beneath concept formation in social theory we used to rely upon without even thinking about it. There are a bunch of it, like ideal types or concrete abstractions or some phenomenological approaches to concepts, which basically are rarely called into question. And so even if you try to take concepts from other traditions or try to see other histories which are neglected in a sense, often this effort to translate data narratives into different theories pass through this hidden logic, which basically reproduces what were the obstacles to be overcome or the changes to be made in theories. So what basically I try to figure out is the main underpinnings to the logic of concept formation in Western social theory. That is a colonial construction, so it is nothing abstract in a sense, but is very historically determined, and it basically operates through exclusion of something and normalization of what has been excluded. So the fascination with the theratology, which is the science of monstrosity, comes from the possibility of rethinking concept formation through the idea of relocating what modernity and social theory had excluded precisely in the middle of the generative grammar of concepts. So how do we bring back what has been excluded and see if this process can produce something different, or even if can bring some concepts which are central in social theory to simply collapse because they are unable to translate what they were expected to grasp or to represent. What I try to do is focus specifically on this process of concept formation, starting from what has been done during the last decades in terms of specifically addressing this topic. So I considered 4 perspectives, which are Gering's critical framework for concept formation in social sciences, Boaventura de Sousa Santos' diatopic hermeneutics, Gurminder connected sociologies, and key is globalized knowledge flows. These four approaches, in my view, cover mainly the two issues which are at stake in concept formation. The first one is how do we select data that we want to analyze? What histories we choose to represent or to not represent? What do we, and why we choose to take some histories and while some other not? And the other, which is more related to cross-cultural translation and involves the semantic aspects of different traditions across multiple geohistorical locations. So we basically confront with this double issue, with this double problem, that if not addressed actually ends up in reproducing what could be named the coloniality of method, that is the ability of Western theory to mortify the possibility of colonial and post-colonial knowledge to claim for their universality, and basically mortify this possibility, making not visible the processes that have brought to the formation of concepts. The coloniality of method operates through three devices. The first is obviously negation, simply the negation of colonial histories, like we are seeing, for instance, in Europe with refugees emergence, simply negating that there is a relation, a colonial relation between the different spaces across the Mediterranean. The second device is the neutralization of colonial subjecthood, in the sense that the colonial relation is recognized, is admitted, but it's always asymmetrical. So the colonial subjecthood is not allowed to express an autonomous agency. This always happens when Western theory uses to look at anti-colonial movements, for instance. The concept of emancipation is significant in this regard because it expresses a way of seeing anti-colonial movements as something that is completely contextualizable into a Western understanding of what the struggles have been. And the third device is something that is more related to the way the process of making other cultures and other knowledge exotic takes place. So what is not European, not Western, and often indigenous is depicted with a sort of caricatural palette. So the whole vision of how that cultures and communities express their own universalities is relegated to something that has more to do with local cultures and nothing more than that. When I tried to apply these views about the possibility of reworking concepts and also explore the way concepts are unable to express a global understanding, which is basically what we are trying to pursue with this project, I approached the concept of capital, trying to see not simply the way the radical criticism to Marx's understanding of capital is related to race studies, to radical race studies, and to indigenous knowledge. Not only the way the understanding of capital is unable to grasp these complexities outside, for instance, the notion of accumulation, but also the way this different understanding of the process of accumulation can modify the very concept of capital, in the sense of going the other way around. So the first move was to try to keep the histories of slavery within the formation of the very notion of exploitation. So it became evident how this tension could add more to the concept of exploitation and extend it to include the notion of thingification, as it has been elaborated, for instance, by Aimé Césaire during the 50s from a Caribbean perspective. While the other move was more related to the way bringing the indigenous understanding of nature within the notion of accumulation of capital actually discloses the notion of capital to a territory that cannot be grasped from within a Western perspective. Not simply the impossibility of selling or conceding the common goods for exploitation, but the very impossibility of understanding the commons in terms as the Western theory has done it. So this creates a sort of uncommonality, not simply a different way of understanding the common, which discloses the notion of capital to something that is different and can be understood through a third step, which I tried to make, that is a semantic slippage between the notion of accumulation in Marx and the notion of Muri by the Japanese thinker Uno Kozo, that studied in after the Second World War the process of transition to capitalism from the feudal Japan. So the interesting in this last part, which is more related to the semantic slippage across different culture, is that when you bring in a different concept from a different cosmology, which tries to interpolate a Western concept like accumulation of capital, this discloses spaces of understanding which were not present in the previous understanding. Particularly in this case, it was interesting to see how, from a Japanese perspective on the transition to capitalism, it was not possible to order the feudal system in time as something that preceded capitalism, because there was a reciprocal interpolation between the two. So there was the violence of capitalism was something that was already present in the violence of the feudal system. So this displaces the linear understanding of the transition and expresses how different social formations share a common ground, which in this case was violence and through asymmetries of power. So this was just an example of how bringing different narratives and different semantics within concepts can enhance and also show the limits of understanding that concepts we are used to in social theory are unable to express or to bring to the fore for a global understanding of social phenomena. So this was basically my brief overview on this drafted material which I'm sharing with you, and well, I'm done.
Perfect 15 minutes. That was keeping with a lot of scientific standards as well. You did not, however, tell us what teratology is, and I think you should be the one bringing it to the wider audience rather than me, because then it would be just my perspective on it. But I suggest we start with questions that I would have had so far to what you have already explained, and then when you want to go into teratology and to the solutions of the problems that you identify, then you can maybe explain it briefly also.
Okay.
So I thought it was a fascinating paper for many reasons, and it was very nice to read it, especially, but not only, but especially for the language, because you have very captivating, very powerful language in which you express the problems that you identify. And this is always hard, but it's harder when it's not your native language. So I've found the poetic dimension of it really, really powerful. And that starts with your concept of the coloniality of method, that I found very well formulated in itself in comparison with, or in the context of, what you call the Conceptual Archive of the West and its coloniality of method. Now, it wasn't clear to me whether the coloniality of methods, as you develop it, is something that you use drawing on Quijano's work, because obviously he coined the term coloniality, but you do not reference Quijano here. I know you have referenced him in other texts, so that might just be because this is a draft. But in case you do mean coloniality in your own way, you should explain how this is a way of coloniality, of method that is different from what Quijano denominates. Because if it is the same thing that he means by the coloniality of power, and you draw on this work in order to explain how this is also something that plays into method and methodology, it would also have to be a bit pushed further to explain how there may have been a colonialism of method, and the colonialism of method is ongoing despite the formal end of colonial rule, right? That would be a very close and derivative reading of Quijano in order to draw from that the concept of coloniality of method. But if it's something different, especially if it's something different, we should learn how you mean it. And maybe related to that, and I know that's already a big question, in terms of the language that you use, I found this idea of mortifying the transformative potential pretty gripping. You say in the paper, the coloniality of method consists in the ability to mortify the transformative potential of the colonial difference, both historically and epistemologically. It incorporates asymmetries of power into categories of analysis whose colonial construction is made invisible by dissolving into apparent conceptual and terminological transparency. Now, the term mortify I found interesting not only because it really brings to the fore the destructive potential also of what you call coloniality of method, but also because it reminds me of a term that is pretty much untranslatable from Spanish, but at the same time epistemologically most useful, and that is ningunear. Ninguno in Spanish means nobody, and ningunear could maybe translated as to nobodify, to deny somebody relevance, so not their existence. It's not the same thing as Césaire's thingification, and it's not dehumanization, but it's denying relevance. You may exist, but it's not of no relevance to us. And this is something that's used colloquially in Latin America with no reference to colonial patterns or to colonial rule, but it can be seen in the context of also what Johannes Fabian has called the denial of co-evilness, right? Denying evilness, denying relevance, and mortifying transformative potential. So I think you are drawing on a series of potential allies here that you could maybe bring in the conversation, not to deny any of the originality of your own argument, but actually to strengthen it, because there were parallel lines of thought that might be even be brought into the conversation. And that last question on this,
yes,
on this point, because you name colonial difference here too, in the definition of the coloniality of method, what colonial difference is that? Is that Partha Chatterjee's understanding of it? Is it Walter Mignola's understanding of it? Or do you have your own different understanding? So this is all part of the larger question of what are your maybe larger references apart from the ones that are present here?
Well, let's start with the teratology then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because simply put, it is the science of embryonic deformation. So the rather than the metaphor, the analogy was with the idea of inoculating something, a generative grammar that can then produce something that is not normalized. So in this sense, it is, let's call it positive understanding of monstrosity, because precisely on the exclusion of and normalization, European social theory established the separation between us and them. So the idea was to bring back what has been excluded in the very generative process of concept. Yeah, the coloniality of method, coloniality draws on Quijano. So is the idea of the matrix of power which continues after the end of formal colonialism, but shifted on a slightly different level of abstraction, which is closer to the idea of method, in a sense that when we talk of method, basically put is the way you do things, and applied to this perspective would be the way you produce concept. That is something that there is a sort of allergy to formalize methodology of concept formations, which in post-colonial theory comes from deconstruction somehow. But try to see how you formalize a method is just a path that is always open to discussion, critique, or dismissal. So the effort was to translate the coloniality on a different level of abstraction that is method, simply put. Yeah, mortifying is related to other ideas, not just to ones that you correctly mentioned. Also to this idea of epistemological biocide. So we often struggle with the notion of recovering what has been lost, but many of the things that have been lost are not recoverable anymore. So this was my semantic push towards mortifying rather than other concepts. And yeah, in fact, even in the analysis of the concept of capital, I came out with a strong notion of capital as destruction, but not in the sense of creative destruction, not in the sense of continuity versus discontinuity, but simply something that cannot be recovered anymore, which gives a totally different sense of what is the intellectual work that you are engaged with. If your perspective is not the possibility of recovering something that is just there and you just have to mine it, but you have to do now because otherwise it gets lost. So. And yeah, the third point about the colonial difference is basically closer to Mignolo understanding of colonial difference, but is also influenced by Sandro Mezzadra understanding of the border as an active device where difference is constantly constructed, and constantly reproduced. So even if we might be talking of post-colonial difference in the contemporary world, actually the post-colonial heavily relies on our understanding of colonial difference. That's why I keep using it instead of moving ahead. It is a concept which still works for me.
Oh, it works for me perfectly as well. It's just useful to identify who you draw on when you drop the concept, because then when you move on, there's, I think, the most important context to understand how you draw your argument has to be historical, because you also mean it historically. And in that sense, if the coloniality that you draw upon is Quijano's coloniality, again, the question is, was there a colonialism of method that was there that has now turned into a coloniality of method, or is that the same thing? Because I think that would actually enrich your argument to give the background of how the colonial method or colonialism of method has worked in order to produce this coloniality of method.
Actually, I referred usually to Wallerstein and Quijano, say. The first one, 1992. So, yeah, which gives a more concrete definition of coloniality. So starting from that definition that was more in sociology and international relations, when you add more abstract elements like the coloniality of method, you can more easily see the difference. Right?
Mm.
Thank you, by the way.
No.
I will add.
Because, there's a whole literature now that is basically in the business of expanding Quijano's concept into more realms, which I'm not sure is always applicable, because he did mean coloniality of power to encompass everything, but at the same time, something that stays at this general level can only be exemplified so much. So unless you really kind of diffuse it into more, or make it more concrete rather, in more dimensions, it's not possible to analyze. So people are talking about coloniality of knowledge and coloniality of citizenship, and coloniality of method was missing. So it is important to spell it out. But then if you spell it out, the historicity of it is maybe also something for a different article, that you would show how that actually came about and what that has to do with science. Or maybe you do that in the book, which I'm actually looking forward to
I just
reading.
did not reference it in this draft, but actually it is fully developed in the introduction of the book, and also in a guest editorial introduction to cultural sociology. Gurminder has contributed to, so it has been already articulated. Yeah.
Okay. Because also when you draw on the kind of criticism that you apply to the four approaches that you take on, you refer to the fact that it's the globalization of knowledge in non-Western worlds, as well as the flows of non-Western cultures and experiences across Europe, that challenge the significance and adequacy of many crucial concepts nowadays. Now, this nowadays comes across a couple of times in the text, and it seems to suggest, maybe it's just a side issue, a presentism in the approach that I don't seem to be hearing in your conceptual engagement, in actually the interest in historical continuities, but it seems to be that the globalization of knowledge is something that prompts us to include different concepts and different approaches today in different ways than it was in the past. And I think that's a bit of a danger to always see an issue of newness in something. That the term globalization itself comes with a lot of that. Certainly Raywin has analyzed a lot of approaches that have done nothing but pretend that they are now global by updating or upscaling whatever they were doing before and putting global in front of it. And I'm not saying that you are doing that at all. I'm just saying if you insist that it's globalization of knowledge today, nowadays, that is prompting us more than ever to do something about how global our knowledge actually is, then if it's nothing, just drop the word. But if it's a more substantive issue and you mean it in a more complex way, it should be spelled out. Because obviously the need for global social theory did not arise with 20th or 19th century globalization. And a lot of people that we actually do not want in this conversation have argued just that. Before it was completely legitimate to just think in terms of local and very small and the national and whatever, but now it's a global world and we have to address these issues now. It's the global that has come to Europe that has made Western Europe make itself aware of that, but the world and knowledge production has always been global.
Yeah, in fact, I agree that it has always been global. I would separate the, let's call it the explanatory dimension of the idea of globalization of knowledge from the normative one, because we could talk of global social theory since 5 centuries, and the nuance which we are trying to add is the normative one. So let's make it more global than it is, where global obviously is always a contested space that always includes some asymmetries of power between who contribute to make it more global and what also are the limits of actually making it global. In fact, one tension that normatively could be established is, in my view, between global and the planetary, that also include a different understanding of what are the actors and what is the understanding of the world as a globe or as a planet. Just to stress the idea that the way I use it in this draft is in a normative dimension rather than in a historical and explanatory way.
Okay. Now, you didn't get into this in the presentation, so I don't know how many people have read all the papers and this paper in particular. But when you go into mapping the theoretical space for the 4 options you analyze, you draw a single Cartesian diagram with X and Y axes and show us how the methodology and the methodological formalization, what you call methodological formalization, and the globalization of knowledge are or are not joined, and you actually find fault with every one of these approaches in one aspect or the other. And this is, if I understood you correctly, where teratology comes in, right? Now, I think it's fascinating that you even can do this, because you have to have a serious engagement with Cartesian thinking and the way it operates in today's world to be able to draw such a diagram for theoretical approaches. But isn't that a contradiction in terms to speak about the decolonization of knowledge and the coloniality of method using a Cartesian diagram?
Well, it depends on how you think about Western science, and in particular, for instance, Cartesian understanding. If you think like an economist, that if you drop 2 lines and the process will be from point A to point B, precisely what the curve connects them, you're crazy. If otherwise you think that you can use a graph as an heuristic device to represent something, there is a very Eurocentric presumption about the way geometry or maths work in the representation of the world. And because the Eurocentric presumption works like this, Europe tries to, from Galileo onwards, to quantify everything, and this is, bad because positivism and neopositivism and so on. But actually, maybe the way the West has used to quantify nature, it's not even the more sophisticated in the world. There are other mathematics which are far more engaging and far more complex, and so and even they have much more ability to simplify than a conventional Cartesian diagram. So I don't see it actually as a contradiction in terms to use this way of representing things and talking about decoloniality, because one thing that I learned from decolonizing knowledge is precisely to anthropologize yourself, no? In the sense that you see your own forms of representation as an indigenous form of representation, and once you don't get it as an asymmetry of power, where you are more effective in representing through numbers reality, I think it's okay even to use a Cartesian diagram.
It's obviously okay. Whatever you can argue, if you can argue your point, it's obviously okay. What I meant is less the way an economist would read the diagram, and I meant this more in an epistemological dimension, because what I think a lot of us object to in terms of Western science or imperial science's way of classifying, and Linnaeus actually had to do something with that, is not so much the business of classifying, the impulse of classification, which anthropologists have argued is always there and is there at the drop of a hat in humans. So if you arbitrarily divide a group of people into 2, within seconds, it has been proven by cognitive science, they start finding differences and similarities, similarities within the own group and differences with the other, although the divide has been arbitrary. But what we object to when we do decolonial, Southern, post-colonial critique is the conjunction between the colonial encounter and the, not so much the need, but the maybe obsession with classification. And in that sense, I think there's been a lot of history of critiquing this kind of conjunction to make at least an elaborate argument for a use of classifying for the classification's sake necessary or desirable. So at least saying, you know, I'm not classifying for classification's sake, but maybe the approaches that I'm looking at are not even trying to do any kind of methodological formalization in the sense that I use the term, right? Because you do draw on several different approaches that come from different intellectual traditions who might not be in the business of looking for methodological formalization in the same way. What I'm saying is the kind of difficulty that might or might not get you into, but that I would be kind of beware of if I were trying to do the same thing, is that you would incorporate the coloniality of method that you're critiquing in your own search for methodological formalization. And once we're on the same page here, okay, trying to avoid risks. If this is indeed a risk, and I would suppose that it is, how do you ensure that your search for methodological formalization is not itself part of a coloniality of method? How do we escape that?
No, I'm sure that it is part.
Okay.
In the sense that what I can have as an horizon is to try to set up a process that maybe in the long run can lead towards something else than what I'm forced to think in now in the historical condition and the university, the neoliberal university, westernized, where I've been studying in. So I do not expect to find the final solution. In fact, the one path that you can take is precisely make explicit what the kind of formalization you think it's better than another one, you can put it in place. When you say that decoloniality is against formalization, I think that this is, so I'm simplifying.
Okay.
Or tries to keep together things in order to avoid formalization. I think that there is a strong understanding of what formalization is. While actually if you take it in a less structured way, you see that there is always an impulse to classify in every culture, in every method of inquiry, even in the decolonial knowledge. You map certain concepts, you define what these concepts are. That was precisely what you asked me at the beginning of your questions. Are you talking of coloniality in this sense or in that sense? So it's even, how to say, it's not, coloniality is a concept, and within coloniality you asked me to define precisely what sort of coloniality. So this is a strong formalization from my point of view. And last thing about the Cartesian. Actually, the Cartesian diagram was not properly from Cartesio, from Descartes. It was elaborated through a complex way of understanding the two dimensions that comes from the Muslim world, starting from the 19th century after Christ. There is a few works by George Saliba that has proven how actually what we see as the Cartesian thinking actually was developed in the Arab world before, at the time of the first Umayyad Caliphate. Sorry, I'm not. I'm sorry for the pronunciation of few words, but George Saliba has written extensively about how the Cartesian diagram comes from the Muslim world, actually.
Just to clarify, I didn't mean that formalization per se is a problem, but that the approaches that you're looking at, whether it's these or others, might just not be looking for the same level of methodological formalization that you're trying to find. So finding fault with them for that could be a bit circular, right? Because if they're not trying to reach a level of methodological formalization for whatever reason, be it because this is not the way their understanding of scientific rigor has been trained, or then it's easy to find fault with something that they never intended to achieve, because that's your conclusion, that the main limit in existing approaches to the problem is the low level of formalization. But what if some of the other approaches were not even trying to do that?
Obviously, if you incorporate the possibility of failure within this notion of, let's insist on formalizing something, you are always open to the possibility that your method is not working, is not going to work. I mean, it is an option that you don't get to the point where a concept in social theory can extend and globalize, or otherwise you can always get to the point where two different concepts insisting on the same social reality but coming from two different traditions are not fully translatable, or otherwise they overlap for a territory, a semantic territory, but then this is too small to engage in full conversation, or otherwise you get to the point where there is a sort of impossibility of translation between the two. What I've tried to do is explaining what are the different possibilities when we engage in this sort of formalization of a method of concept formation, which actually includes the possibility of failure. It's like when you in informatics, for instance, an operating system is better when it tells you what the error is. No, that's why the Mac is better than the PC, or Linux is better than the Mac. No, so it comes out and say, look, this is the error that you have done. So.
But that's precisely my point. Why call it failure?
Huh?
Why call it failure? Because it could be that approaches that you look at and methods that are being proposed are not even trying to become applicable or become generalizable. So conceiving of their now non-applicability as failure is within
the impossibility of working a different concept when your methodology is to develop concept is a failure, which doesn't mean that it's bad. I mean, no?
It could be that it's a different logic behind it. It could be that concepts want to become fluid and then generate other forms of thinking rather than become applicable themselves. And then you're putting these concepts to test for something that they never try to achieve. You might be. Some might fail in your sense because they try to achieve the same thing.
That's why my method finishes and starts another one.